The disclaimer, as most speakers have it, with this title, A Spectacle of Gore and Horror, the French Revolution and its Gothic Representations, I do believe you are in for something gory and bloody and violent. And given this picture of a decapitated Marie Antoinette, part of the Erwin Olaf's Bloody Royals series, I think, yeah, it is obvious that there will be graphic and violent language and some prints as well. Some of them, as I noted earlier this day, have some nudity, depending on what you perceive as nudity, but it's satire, so I think we can go with that. All right. So, the French Revolution was a watershed in human history, and as scholars have suggested, it was the event that came to define the meaning of revolution in its modern sense. The revolution aimed to establish the principles of democracy, liberty, equality, and fraternity, and to overthrow the old regime of government. The fall of the Bastille, the epitome of despotic rule and of the ANCIEN regime, was the milestone of the revolution. In her famous Letters from France, Helen Maria Williams describes the festivities celebrating the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille as a shared experience of elevated joy, pointing out that some spectators exclaimed, "La Révolution française est cimentée avec de l'eau au lieu du sang." That is, in English, the French Revolution is cemented with water instead of blood. How strange and displaced would those exclamations sound a few years later, given the bloody violence that was unleashed upon France, when again Williams would write that brutality as well as terror was the order of day, and that every day was marked by the turbulent sensations of dismay and horror. The initial enthusiasm for liberation from absolute monarchy was quickly superseded by mass violence and factions among the different radical groups in France. This talk will focus on the English reception of the revolution, laying particular emphasis on its representations and the use of Gothic aesthetics to depict the atrocities that marked the progress of the revolution. That the Gothic was readily associated with the French Revolution in the 1790s was evident from its reception across the Channel, which partly accounts for Gothic fiction's unsavory reputation. As Joseph Crawford has observed, quote, "It did not seem accidental that this new literary fascination with fear and violence should have arisen in the same decade that witnessed the Reign of Terror." Unquote. As a contested genre, the Gothic was considered to tacitly promulgate political ideas in support of the French Revolution, and so provoke seditious activities in Britain. The famous satirical article in the monthly magazine, The Terrorist System of Novel Writing, for example, establishes the connection between the French Revolution, Robespierre's system of terror and virtue, and the popularity of Gothic fiction. But alas, the author writes, "So prone are we to imitation that we have exactly and faithfully copied the system of terror, if not in our streets and in our fields, at least in our circulating libraries and in our closets." On the French side, Marquis de Sade wrote in his essay on novels that the Gothic novel was the product of the revolutionary activities in France that spread over the continent. Writers, de Sade writes, had to look to hell for help in composing their alluring novels and project that what everyone already knew into the realm of fantasy by confining themselves to the history of man in that cruel time. But we would not be focusing on novels in this talk. Let us first briefly note what caused the revolution and the events that followed. The Ancien regime was perceived as the rule of tyranny and oppression. The court was rampant with favoritism and prejudice, avarice and hypocrisy. The monarch, the nobility, and the clergy were exerting their power on the impoverished people. The economic crisis, heavy taxations, and abject poverty fed into years of indignation and slavish oppression, which finally galvanized the French people into action when Louis XVI proved incapable as a monarch. Louis XVI was considered an ineffectual and irresolute ruler, and although he made concessions and ceded part of his authority to the National Assembly, after the storming of the Bastille, his subsequent actions made the French people doubt his support of a progress towards constitutional monarchy. The fact that Marie Antoinette had considerable power over the king's decision-making, the secret conspiratorial plots with the enemy she was accused of hatching, compelled the people to believe that the success of the revolution could be compromised if the monarch's power be not curtailed. When it comes to textual and visual representations, the Ancien regime was depicted as a mythical hydra, as in, for example, the satirical print on the slide. The inscription accompanying the image describes it as a hermaphroditic, ferocious, bloodthirsty monster, which feeds on the blood, tears, and the subsistence of the unhappy. It only desires to satisfy its ambition and its insatiable greed. It thinks everything that breathes must be submitted to it and only for it. Desolation, famine, and death are always in its wake. This description highlights the despotism and tyranny of monarchical rule as monstrous and unnatural. The monster is depicted as being attacked by the revolutionaries. The time span given in the print coincides with the time of the fall of the Bastille on the 14th of July 1789, and provides a figurative presentation of the events that initiated the first major stage of the revolution. Zoomorphic representations are typical of depicting the monarchs, for example, as horned harpies preying on livestock to satiate their voracious appetite. In this print here, entitled "The Two Are One in the Same," Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI are portrayed as having one body, which is part hyena with serpentine hair and part horned goat. Such representations are typical of anti-royalists. Mary Robinson's poem, Ainsi va le monde, which openly praises the revolution in its early versions, uses the image of the harpy to refer to the Ancien regime. The poem offers a palpably Gothicized rendition of the political events. The fall of the Bastille is described through the use of Gothic imagery, where in her black Bastille the harpy fed on the warm crimson drops her fangs had shed, while recreant malice mocked the sufferer's sigh, while regal lightnings darted from her eye, where deep mysterious whispers murmured round, and death stalked sullen over the treacherous ground. Robinson depicts the fall of the Bastille as a dreadful event. The tempestuous weather and sense of mystery which permeates the lines, as well as the idea of treachery, bloodshed, and death, lend the description an ominous note to harbinger the advent of political apocalypse. It should be pointed out, however, that Robinson, although a supporter of the Revolution's struggle for liberty and equality, was an admirer of the French Queen and deplored the violence inflicted on the French monarchs and the country. I will return to some of her poems on the regicide later on. So when the monk Matthew Lewis was imagining the episode of St. Ursula's ruthless murder by the infuriated mob and the attack of the convent of St. Clair, he was drawing inspiration from the events surrounding the capture of the Bastille, while also fueling his imagination by the bloody horrors of Jacobin terror that ensued in the following years. The initial stage of the revolution, marked by the destruction of the Bastille and the establishment of the First French Republic, was its honeymoon period, which brought fresh hope for a new dawn and regeneration for humanity. It had a huge impact across the Channel and served as inspiration to many English philosophers, writers, and theologians. Mary Wollstonecraft, for example, wrote that, quote, "The revolution, it is true, soon introduced the corruption that has ever since been corroding British freedom." End quote. Together with the American War of Independence, the French Revolution was perceived as the realization of the biblical prophecy of the apocalypse and the coming of new heaven on earth. Wordsworth's much-quoted description of the initial reception of the Revolution is an apt example to illustrate the enthusiasm for change that had seized the whole of Europe. O pleasant exercise of hope and joy! For mighty were the auxiliaries which then stood upon our side. We who were strong in love. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meagre, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance, when reason seemed the most to assert her rights, when most intent on making of herself a prime enchantress, to assist the work which then was going forward in her name. Like many of his contemporaries who were infatuated with the idealism of the Revolution, Wordsworth perceives it as a dawn, offering hope and renewal. It is significant that the strict prescriptions of custom, law, and statute are here compared to a country in romance. This association of the past with romance and chivalry evokes Edmund Burke's famous lamentation that the age of chivalry was gone, as he saw the past as a venerable paragon and endorsed the continuity of custom and tradition. In his poem, Wordsworth imagines reason as an enchantress, which stresses its role as one of the driving principles of the revolution, but it also implies the disillusionment that followed, as a magical spell that was broken by the stark reality that the world was not transforming into a utopia. The initial optimism was quickly replaced by the dark developments of the events that followed, namely the reign of Jacobin terror, marked by the September massacres and the regicide of the French monarchs. The following lines from Robinson's Monody to the memory of the late Queen of France present the political context of the early 1790s as a scene of terror escalating to a bloodthirsty frenzy where man turns against man. While all are rulers, all, alas, are slaves. Each dreads his fellow, each his fellow braves. Oh, in one horrid mass, all miseries blend. Each shuns his brother, and each fears his friend. The son with blood-stained fortune strikes the sire. The parent smiles to see the son expire. Against his lord the vassal wields his spear. The vaunting atheist mocks the vestal's tear. Mary Robinson deftly captures the anarchy and discord that seized revolutionary France. It was fear and suspicion of conspiratorial designs that threatened the infant republic and therefore triggered the onset of mass violence and slaughter, thus demythologizing the romanticized perception of the revolution as it existed in popular consciousness, especially in the minds of its English proponents. Thus, the enthusiasm for reform gained negative connotations, as it became synonymous with mob violence and emotional excess. That is, it was dangerous and potentially destructive. This excess demanded its own means of representation. Ronald Paulson argued that, quote, the sheer novelty of the French Revolution required new forms of representation, and even more basically raised the central aesthetic challenge, how to represent the unprecedented, unquote. The Gothic proved a fitting mode of signification to articulate the terror that transformed the struggle for democracy into a horror show of violence, fear, frenzy, persecution, and bloody savagery. Conservatives and radicals alike employed the Gothic to impart political messages. Sue Chaplin has pointed out that during the period, quote, supporters and opponents of the revolution in France used the well-known tropes and symbols of Gothic romance in order to validate their own reading of events across the Channel. Indeed, Chaplin continues, Gothic romance in the immediate post-revolutionary period became a highly significant hermeneutic tool for reading and narrating the revolution abroad and its impact at home, end quote. The Gothic became a vehicle to express cultural and political anxieties. In conservative writings such as Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, the Gothic past is nostalgically evoked as a time of an exemplary governance, whereas in radical discourse it is associated with feudal rule, superstition, irrationality, and patriarchal oppression. In short, with obsolete systems and beliefs that no longer apply to the changing context of modernity. Thomas Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft responded to Burke's defense of gentility and aristocracy, seeing it as a repressive system that promoted inequality through the laws of primogeniture, restrictive codes, class division, unjust social systems, and institutions. Here is a passage from Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Man, worth quoting in full. I perceive from the whole tenor of your reflections that you have a mortal antipathy to reason, but if there is anything like argument or first principles in your wild declamation, behold the result, that we are to reverence the rust of antiquity and term the unnatural customs which ignorance and mistaken self-interest have consolidated, the sage fruit of experience, nay, that if we do discover some errors, our feelings should lead us to excuse with blind love or unprincipled filial affection the venerable vestiges of ancient days. The lines are steeped in Wollstonecraft's indignation at what she deems Burke's false reasoning and his mourning the past, its flaws and prescriptivism, which Wollstonecraft saw as limiting society and its progress. The old days are rusty, their laws are perceived as aberrant and unreasonable. In addition, both Paine and Wollstonecraft criticize the use of Burke's language as overly sentimental, hence histrionic, artificial, and paradoxical, instead of objectively presenting historical fact. Burke's reflections were an answer to Richard Price's sermon, A Discourse on the Love of Our Country, a key text which sparked off a chain reaction of responses that entered into dialogue with each other. Price posited that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were evidence for humanity's awakening from ignorance and superstition towards enlightenment and liberty. His endorsement of the French Revolution and disparagement of monarchical and priestly arbitrary power provoked Burke's displeasure. In his reflections, Burke demonized the Revolution, presenting it as a Gothic drama vested in sentimental and even grotesque rhetoric, whereby he sought to convey the unnatural essence of the events and their anti-social ideology. As Joseph Crawford reminds us, quote, "It was the tropes of Gothic fiction which allowed many British writers to articulate what they believed those crowds to have done and what their actions might mean, so that when they wrote their accounts of the unfolding events in France, they often did so in markedly Gothic terms." End quote. Burke perceived the Revolution as a mixture of conflicted emotions. Quote, "Everything seems out of nature in this strange chaos of levity and ferocity, and of all sorts of crimes jumbled together with all sorts of follies. In viewing this monstrous tragicomic scene, the most opposite passions necessarily succeed, and sometimes mix with each other in the mind. Alternate contempt and indignation, alternate laughter and tears, alternate scorn and horror." End quote. It is significant that Burke describes the events as if appearing on stage, as the trope of the spectacle is of a particular significance to the events that defined the French Revolution and its aftermath. When Thomas Carlyle wrote The French Revolution in 1837, he took this approach to another level by writing the history of the revolution from his epic omniscient gaze in the present tense to simulate the immediacy of the events as if they were unfolding with the act of reading. The reflections aim to cement the British Constitution as a functional model which Burke pits against the French anti-rational and amoral strive for liberation from the old regime. Burke's aesthetic pastiche has been a point of discussion by period and contemporary critics, considering it as a revolution in itself. Katie Castellano has argued that by mixing a plethora of generic styles, quote, "the legalistic Latinate idiom, prophecy, the epistle, the captivity narrative, the Gothic, chivalric romance, the grotesque, tragedy, and sensibility, Burke creates an aesthetically innovative new form of writing while writing the first articulation of a conservative tradition." End quote. It is this generic incongruity that Paine and Wollstonecraft criticized, as indicated earlier. Burke draws upon Gothic rhetoric and tropes to translate the excesses and the violence of the French revolutionaries and to criticize the revolution as a disturbance of traditional social and political order. Burke's envisioning of the centrifugal forces of revolutionary zeal and the dangers it poses prophetically anticipates the Jacobin terror and the physical manifestation of violence and horror that he coded linguistically in his narrative. One of the letters is of particular interest here. Drawing on Gothic rhetoric and histrionics, Burke describes the women's siege of Versailles on the 5th and 6th of October 1789 as a spectacle of terror and violence, the atrocious spectacle, as he refers to it later on. The scene could have easily found its way into the plot of a Gothic romance. Marie Antoinette, much like a Radcliffean heroine, is the embodiment of persecuted innocence. From this sleep, the queen was first startled by the voice of the sentinel at her door, who cried out to her to save herself by flight. that this was the last proof of fidelity he could give, that they were upon him and he was dead. Instantly he was cut down. A band of cruel ruffians and assassins, reeking with his blood, rushed into the chamber of the queen, and pierced with 100 strokes of bayonets and poniards the bed, from whence this persecuted woman had but just time to fly almost naked, and through ways unknown to the murderers, had escaped to seek refuge at the feet of a king and husband, not secure of his own life for a moment. The queen is molested by a bloodthirsty and ungodly band of cruel ruffians and assassins. The phallic symbolism of the bayonets and poniards striking at the queen's bed, her private realm no longer safe from external threat and assault, represents the violation of monarchical order. Burke imagines the scene as an allegorical rape, further strengthened by the description of the queen as flying away for her life almost naked, seeking the protection of her husband, the king. Burke invests his account of the events with dramatic input and capitalizes on the sentimental representation of Marie Antoinette's vulnerability, both as a woman and as a monarch. His theatrical melodrama and performative rhetoric to describe the storming of Marie Antoinette's bedroom is significant as it reveals how the private space of the French queen as a woman and a mother and her public role as a monarch are intertwined and are equally endangered by the political climate. This image of Marie Antoinette will be a common one in poetic works in the wake of the monarch's imprisonment and regicide. I will briefly refer to some poems later on in the talk. Burke continues to reimagine the immediate past in graphic and gory terms. This king, to say no more of him, and this queen and their infant children, were then forced to abandon the sanctuary of the most splendid palace in the world, which they left swimming in blood, polluted by massacre, and strewed with scattered limbs and mutilated carcasses. Thence they were conducted into the capital of their kingdom. Two had been selected from the unprovoked, unresisted, promiscuous slaughter, which was made of the gentlemen of birth and family who composed the king's bodyguard. These two gentlemen, with all the parade of an execution of justice, were cruelly and publicly dragged to the block and beheaded in the great court of the palace. Their heads were stuck upon spears and led the procession, whilst the royal captives who followed in the train were slowly moved along amidst the horrid yells and shrilling screams and frantic dances and infamous contumelies and all the unutterable abominations of the furies of hell in the abused shape of the vilest of women. As the passage shows, the violence continues to escalate in Burke's account. The French monarchs are taken captive by the frenzied female crowd, forced out of the comfort of Versailles, now a sanguinary scene of mangled bodies. Paris is also described as a site of death and desolation. Here and elsewhere in the Reflections, Burke ominously anticipates the mass executions of the Reign of Terror a few years later. Burke presents the scene as a grotesque spectacle, reminiscent of a distorted Dionysian ecstatic cult. The women are described as monstrous maniacs. They are ferocious, blasphemous, appalling. Monstrosity is a key trope in the representation of the Revolution, both in terms of royalist and anti-royalist stances. It was used to foreground the unnaturalness and aberrancy of what each considered to be the norm. The zoomorphic representations of Marie Antoinette as half woman, half hyena, and half harpy, shown earlier, also aimed at signifying the monstrosity and rapacity she was accused of, that is, her deviance from social normativity and from her duties as a monarch. Antoinette was the Austrian she-wolf, as guilty of every crime, every form of moral corruption, every perversion, to quote Stefan Zweig. Her interference in public affairs and her lax morals provoked public indignation, as her behavior was interpreted as overpowering and unbecoming for a woman, and hence monstrous. Burke's envisioning of the female mob as analogous to the furies of hell also underscores the idea of female monstrosity, as the peasant women's loose and belligerent behavior breaks the codes of femininity and that of social regulations. It would be apposite to make a little detour to look at this satirical print by Thomas Rowlandson. The print employs similar imagery to that of Burke to emphasize the contrast between notions of British liberty and French liberty. British liberty is embodied by Britannia, calm and poised against a serene maritime backdrop, the Lion meekly lying by her side. Her scales representing justice are balanced in her grip, while in her other hand she is holding the Magna Carta, the document ratifying liberty from absolute monarchical power and granting the nobility limited rights. In stark contrast to this pristine image is the grotesque representation of Marianne. French liberty is portrayed as unnatural, signified by the masculinized and disproportionate features of Marianne, which highlight the female monstrosity associated with the French Revolution. To further underscore this monstrosity, the drawing shows Marianne with Gorgon hair, aquiline nose, and a serpentine tongue. In her hand, she is holding a dagger and a trident. Carrying the freshly decollated head of the corpse she is trampling on, and the hearts of other victims stuck upon the spears. One can observe the horror of the decapitated man captured on his face. The backdrop is a desert scene of murder and devastation. The body of a hanged man is still dangling on a lamppost. It is not Marianne but Britannia who is carrying the Phrygian cap of liberty on her trident. In her letters written in France in the summer of 1790, Helen Maria Williams provides a vivid account of the anniversary festivities of the fall of the Bastille, where people had gathered to witness the grand celebrations of the festival of the Fête de la Fédération. Neil Freystadt and Susan Lancer point out in the introduction to the Broadview edition of the letters that, quote, the 1790 volume imagines the entire revolution as a sublime spectacle, carrying forth the spirit of the Federation, appealing to the noblest human sentiments, and establishing aesthetic and moral harmony across differences of sex, race, and condition, unquote. This view of universal jubilation, however, was to be shortly superseded by the grim realities of Robespierre's bloody doctrine of terror and virtue, which turned the initial zest for reform and democracy into a nightmare of fear, violence, persecution, and massacre. Williams records the terror in her letters containing a sketch of the politics of France, in which she describes the developments in Paris from her position as a witness and as a victim of the persecutions of English people in France. She sees Robespierre as a vulgar and sanguinary despot, and his government as a dark drama of which France has been the desolated scene and Europe the affrighted spectator. Later on in her sketch, Williams writes that, quote, all the horrors which have cast their sanguinary cloud over the glories of the Revolution, which have given strength to despots and arguments to slaves, unquote, began with the Jacobins' insurrection. When in 1790, Burke envisioned that the course the revolution would take would be one that justified murder, vengeance, and fear in the name of the welfare of the people, he prophesied rightly. As indicated earlier, with the violent turn of the revolution, the persecution of the royal family, their imprisonment and regicide, the French monarchs assumed the status of martyrs in the poetic imagination, especially Marie Antoinette, whose position as a victimized woman and mother resonated with women writers across the Channel. Mary Robinson was one of the writers who took the Queen's fate to heart. She published an anonymous treatise, Impartial Reflections on the Present Situation of the Queen of France in 1791, to vindicate the Queen and to express her hopes for a just trial at the Revolutionary Tribunal, hopes that were not fulfilled. Robinson wrote a number of poems on the French monarchs, which employed Gothic rhetoric to communicate the physical and psychological horrors they experienced. In a fragment supposed to be written near the temple at Paris on the night before the execution of Louis XVI, Robinson envisions the king's last night before his execution. Robinson paints a picture of impending natural disaster to create an ominous atmosphere with the supernatural touch. Chilling dews begin to soar, the owl shrieks from the tottering tower, dread watchbird of the witching hour. Spectres from their charnel cells cleave the air with hideous yells. And these are just some of the lines from from the slide. The poem depicts the dissolution of social and moral order as enlightened principles vanish from the scene. Reason, shrinking from her gaze, flies the scene in wild amaze, while trembling pity dies to see the barbarous sons of anarchy drench their unnatural hands in regal blood, while patriot virtue sinks beneath the whelming flood. In the poem, there are many references to highlight the loss of human values, which have been displaced by anarchy and bloodthirsty vengefulness. Gothic images such as death, the poisonous chalice, the turbid sky, the agonizing hearts of men, the ghastly throng, blood-stained myriads, savage ire, the dreary shade of night, the frenzied shriek, mortal fears, the flaming sword and hideous glare of the demon wrath, show the cruelty and aggression that had seized France. In another poem written on Marie Antoinette's imprisonment in the dungeon prior to her execution, Robinson ventriloquizes the Queen of France to articulate her agony as a woman, a wife, and a mother, thus conflating the Queen's public and private roles in the image of the martyred woman. She uses various metonymical and metaphorical terms to underscore the cruelty of Marie Antoinette's persecutors. For instance, one reads of inhuman hands, fell barbarity, savage tigers, tyrant jailer. These emphasize the lack of human sympathy of the people who had assumed power to reform the status quo by instituting the principles of democracy, but proved as despotic and tyrannical in treating the royal family. Marie Antoinette is haunted by paranoid thoughts and wild imaginings of seeing again and again the slaughter of the already dead king. Wherever I turn, 1,000 ills appear, armed at all points in terrible array, pale, hoodwinked murder, ever lurking near, and coward cruelty that shuns the day. See, they pierce with many a recreant sword the mangled bosom of my bleeding lord. Matthew Lewis, famous for The Monk, as you know, also wrote an unpublished poem entitled France and England in 1793, which borrows on the martyred mother figure motif to depict Marie Antoinette during her imprisonment. The spectator in the poem is the angel Freedom, who dismally observes the anarchy that has engulfed the country. France is a bloody scene of horror where humanity has turned monstrous. Here the wild people drenched the soil with blood and bathed exulting in the crimson flood. Justice was spurned, religion owed no more. The holiest shrines were dyed with human gore. The French are bloodthirsty wild people who are viciously relishing in the bloodshed and disorder of their own making. Against this backdrop of unremitting violence and threatening horrors, Freedom visits the imprisoned Marie Antoinette in the temple to witness her suffering. The images Lewis adopts are reminiscent of those quoted from Robinson's poems. Marie Antoinette's prison is a dreary scene of psychic unrest, fear, and tribulation. Where rear the temple's walls their massy height, whose threatening horrors, scowling o'er the scene, hold in their drear embrace a captive queen. Amidst these glooms profound, these frowning towers, sad Antoinette consumes the fearful hours, and mourns the day she left the Austrian climes, to hear her thoughtless errors taxed as crimes. Scorned as a sovereign, slandered as a wife, almost debarred the coarse support of life, wasted with agony, with sickness weak, on her fair hand she rests her faded cheek, while her stern jailers gaze with eyes of stone, and taunting mock the tear, or chide the groan. Confined between the dingy walls of the tower of the temple, Marie Antoinette is tormented by her thoughts of her fate, her anxieties, and her fears for her children. Lewis capitalizes on a sentimental presentation of the queen, imagining her as weak and emaciated, exhibiting a ghastly presence. Like Robinson, Lewis underlines the cruelty of Marie Antoinette's inhumane treatment by her jailers, who, driven by their scorn for the queen, show no sympathy either for the woman or for the mother. Finally, I will briefly turn your attention to another poem that deals with the political context of the early 1790s. Charlotte Smith's The Emigrants, written in 1793, allegedly her most overt political poem, shows both a strong political stance and a concern for the victims of the Revolution. The Emigrants engages with the aftermath of the French Revolution and the exile of the French aristocrats and clergy, who were forced to flee the country and seek asylum in England to escape the massacres that turned the noble ideals of the Revolution into sheer terror. The poem consists of 2 books, and I will focus on an excerpt from the second book. Here the vignettes of terror grow even darker than in the first book. The driving principles of the Revolution, reason and liberty, having been destroyed by ruffian hands, make the French scene a gory spectacle, where on the ruined mass, flushed with hot blood, the fiend of discord sits in savage triumph, mocking every plea of policy and justice, as she shows the headless corpse of one whose only crime was being born a monarch. Later on in the poem, Smith paints a vivid picture of the atrocities of the Revolution. Sorry, that was the part. The moping clouds held heavy, charged with rain, and bursting over the mountain's misty brow, deluged as with an inland sea the vales, where through the sullen evening's lurid gloom, rising like columns of volcanic fire, the flames of burning villages illumined the waste of water, and the wind that howled along its troubled surface brought the groans of plundered peasants and the frantic shrieks of mothers for their children, while the brave, to pity still alive, listened aghast to these dire echoes, hopeless to prevent the evils they beheld, or check the rage, whichever, as the people of one land meet in contention, fires the human heart with savage thirst of kindred blood, and makes man lose his nature, rendering him more fierce than the gaunt monsters of the howling waste. By deploying images of gloom, rage, and frenzy, Smith graphically represents the inhuman horrors of the Reign of Terror, showing the unremitting forces of political zeal taken to an extreme. Smith presents the wartime situation as a cataclysmic event, equating wise politicians, as she sarcastically defines them, with closet murderers, conspiring as if in a Gothic plot to hatch plans and stratagems how to control Europe to serve their own political interests. The images of dread, violence, and death accentuate the disruption of order, both social and moral. The sketch of the helpless mother trying to defend her child and dying to protect it provides a stark commentary on the perverse turn of the Revolution. Smith's nearly grotesque representation of the frenzied revolutionaries as prowling monsters that from other hills, more inaccessible and wilder wastes, lured by the scent of slaughter, follow fierce, contending hosts, and to polluted feuds, a dire increase of horrors, further suggests the inhumanity that sprang from the impassioned zeal for freedom. The depiction of the feudal lord coming back to his castle to find the bleeding corpses of his family and household, and that of the wild, raving maniac, whom a fate so sudden and calamitous has robbed of reason, seek to illustrate the exigencies that the thirst for privy power produce at the expense of innocent people and the nation as a whole. Smith presents the Revolution as a horrid tragedy of universal suffering. The world has been torn asunder by political divisions and tumults. It is a suffering globe, because people with savage fangs tear her bleeding breast. The association of savagery and fangs with vampirism further accentuates the bloodthirstiness and sickness that mutilate a body and feed upon it to gratify base desires. The earth is represented as an innocent female victim, ravished by man's insatiable cravings, thus treading underfeed Christian principles. To conclude, let us look at this satirical print by James Guray, The Destruction of the French Colossus, which depicts the destruction of France as a political and military power, here referred to as a wicked nation. France is imagined as a monstrous titan with serpentine hair, its limbs covered in the blood that was shed in its progress. The guillotine, a symbol of the reign of terror and its politics of violence, mockingly bears the inscription Fraternity, while it is still dripping with the blood of its victims. The head of the decapitated Louis XVI, moreover, hangs as a medallion around the monster's neck. There are pistols and daggers stacked in the tricolor band which says equality, here presented as another symbol of violence and militarism. One of the Titan's feet is trampling on religious symbols, a cross and the Bible, as well as the scales of justice, whereas the liberty cap falling from its head resembles more a cap and bells. At the top of the drawing is the hand of mighty Britannia, depicted as a deity, administering the final blow to destroy the furious monster with the power of her righteous lightning bolt. The satirical sketch aptly shows how the idealist principles of the revolution were turned into instruments of torture and destruction. Thus, when Catherine Morland, in Austen's Northanger Abbey, enthusiastically exclaims that something very shocking indeed will soon come out in London, something which is to be uncommonly dreadful and possibly filled with murder and everything of the kind, it is not surprising that Eleanor Turney's ready association would be the dreadful riot of a secret plot of internal insurrection, as the fear that England would replicate the French model preyed on popular consciousness. So that's the end. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Again, I noticed a couple of differences. Exciting, thank you. Keeping it fresh for me as well. So thank you. That's a lot of information and a lot of things to think about. So I don't know. It was fantastic and it was very, very good. Do
Thank
you
you.
have some questions that they would like to ask? You can ask them in the chat or you can ask them by video, whichever you prefer.
Oh, is it right if I ask a question?
Of course, yeah.
Great. Oh, I really enjoyed that, thanks. And it's great to see Mary Robinson quoted, as she's one of my favourite poets. It's more of a question that I thought you might know the answer to, because I read it somewhere and I've forgotten. In English fashion, I can't remember if it was the French Revolution or the American Revolution. They sort of started the revolution headband for women. And I don't know if you know if it is the French Revolution that comes from.
Could be, because French fashion was also considered to, in a way, implicitly communicate radical ideas. That's why, in terms of fashion, they were kind of criticized, right? So it could be that, because they also came with the how was it called? This band they put on their heads. Cockade, right? Cockade was it? Yeah. So it might be the band that for female fashions.
Oh, thanks. So I think it probably is French Revolution, not American Revolution.
It should be one of both. Yeah. I need to investigate this further, because that this topic about fashion and its, again, political implications has been an interest to me, but I just haven't had the time to delve further because of other
Well, thanks
research.
So there's a question in the chat for you.
Do you have any recommendations for historical books in terms of what period? Because Carlyle's is a very interesting book on the French Revolution, because it poses it as history, but it actually is, again, a narrative that is unique in its own terms, because as I briefly noted here in this talk, Carlyle, just like Burke, in a way, imagines the revolution rather than following a historical fact. So it is a nice text. And it is also interesting that during the period we have this strife on women's part to be more objective, and even in terms of writing, to use less flowery language, as they call it, and to present facts. Catherine Macaulay, for example, and her historical narratives. And then you have writers such as Burke and Carlyle, who relish in their imagination, so to speak, in order to write the history of the French Revolution. In terms of, I have it on here, by the way. I think this is the Oxford History of the French Revolution. It's a very nice one. It provides you with succinct historical information by William Doyle, so you could read that as well. I think it's nicely written.
Lots of comments that are mostly just yay, which is good. Good feedback. Does anyone else have any more questions or points that they would like to bring up or ask? Don't know if you can see that point at the side.
Yeah, as well. But as I pointed out earlier to the other class, I'm not investigating the French writings on the revolution. Perhaps I should start. But yeah. And it was actually, if I'm not mistaken, because I have read some excerpts, he also provides a very unsavory account of Marie Antoinette as this impudent woman, so to speak, right? Because of her morals, again, something that we discussed in the first class, and her reckless sexual appetite. Okay, so a comment, this is more of a comment. Yeah, well, it was a way, especially for women writers, to publish their works if they had a rich aristocratic patron. So Mary Robinson's patron was the Duchess of Devonshire. So her first volume of poems was dedicated to her. But yeah, is this a continuation?
Yeah.
And just to open up a bracket here, as a continuation of our morning chat about Marie Antoinette, there was a comment whether women poets, women writers only took to heart the Queen's fate, right? The Queen's case. What about common people? And as an afterthought, I thought of Anne Yearsley, who also wrote an elegy to the Queen. And Anne Yearsley was the dairy poet, right? Mm-hmm. And it is interesting how even low-class poets who needed a patron also took to heart the case of the French monarch, because of what we pointed out earlier, that Marie Antoinette was considered as every woman, as a symbol of womanhood, because of this victimhood she had to suffer. So I just wanted to point this out.
Interesting. Do you find with poets like, I mean, Mary Robinson and Williams and Smith, are you finding that they're, I mean, with obviously with some of the writers in that 1790, 1794 period, there's a really sharp change in how they're talking about and representing the French Revolution. Would you say that you're seeing that as well in these poets that you're particularly talking about today? And how does that manifest?
Yes, there is again a change in terms of their reception of the French Revolution in its initial stages and towards the end of the century, because Mary Robinson, for example, she openly embraced it, and Siva Le Monde was actually written as a response to Robert Mary's poem, which is again openly radical, and she was associated with those radical circles throughout her life, as we talked about it in the morning with Charles Fox and other politicians, and she was a supporter, but with this turn of the French Revolution towards violence and all the atrocities that followed, she tempered her radicalism. And even Siva Le Monde, it was modified, so she revised it, and her daughter as well revised it, so as to temper those more explicitly radical comments. And again, just with radical women writers of the period, they continued to support the ideals of the revolution, right? Equality, liberty, the natural rights of man, and these topics manifest in their poetic works as well. And something that again came as an afterthought to our previous conversation, because we discussed some of Robinson's novels as well. And it is interesting how I think the more political arguments, at least to my mind, are made into the poetry instead of, like they're more overt in the poetry instead of in the novels. But yeah, so women's place in society for both Smith and Williams and Robinson is a major topic in their works, and slavery as well as part of the discourse of sensibility and this liberty for everyone, right? And at some point I mentioned the trampling of Christian principles, and this is again important in this radical discourse because from the point of view of Christianity, again, everyone is equal. So it was used in this advocacy for equality of all people, regardless of race, gender, and so on, and class as well. And I think this also contributes to this idea of Marie Antoinette as a woman, right, in terms of gender instead of as a monarch. But it is again a very tricky, should I call it, issue, because we have both camps, right? I have spared you here the pornographic accounts of Marie Antoinette, but again, those perceptions of the anti-royalists of the woman are unfavorable, because they relate womanhood to, you know, sexual lascivity and prostitution even, right? Whereas the supporters of this victimized womanhood see her as a victim of the government, of people's rage, and they are ready to vindicate her from all those crimes that she was accused of, because of her position as I said, a martyred woman, a martyred wife, because they could relate to that, to that role that she had in terms of the oppressive patriarchal codes that suppressed women in all spheres, education, writing, even in the household. So yeah, that was a bit long, but yeah.
No, I think it's relating to that question that's been asked as well by Elle. I'm not sure of what you think.
Yeah. So the switch is precisely the regicide, and actually the imprisonment of the French monarchs and their persecution. And she kind of, she was stripped off of this regal attire, right, of the monarch and of the ruler, to gain this this martyrdom as a victim. So this switch is, I think, because I'm my research is based on, as I mentioned here, the English reception of the turn of this radical mindset to a more conservative-ish, if I may call it like this, stance. So in order to to deplore the revolution, to criticize the revolution, they needed a symbol of that, and Marie Antoinette became that symbol, despite her her behavior. So as every woman in society could be vindicated, right? Because what was she actually to be vindicated of? They wanted equality, right? They wanted to have the same power in both spheres, the public and the private. So hence this blurring between the lines of Antoinette, the monarch, Antoinette, the woman.
Cool.
I hope this answers your question. Indeed, yeah, she may not have been as bad as history makes out, as TC G points out. Indeed, and because she never provided a personal account of her fate, so there is no journal, no memoirs or something to present her point of view. So she, in a way, is this mythological figure. And as we can see from those historical sources, she is the Austrian wolf on the one hand, and then she is this victimized woman on the other hand. So in that treatise I mentioned, written by Robinson, her case is that it was the court into which Antoinette was married that in a way contributed to this flamboyant behavior of hers. So again, the blame is put on the French court. So she came this innocent Austrian girl to France, to the French court, and hence, as such, it was a hive, as Robinson calls it, of hypocrisy and chicanery and prejudice and favoritism and all these. So, and in her poems on the Queen, Robinson, I didn't have time here to focus on that, but she praises the fortitude of the Queen and her virtue as a strong woman. Even in the face of adversity, she bore it all with dignity. And this is again seen as kind of selfishness from the anti-royalists. And there is this account that it is even captured on a painting when she was led to her execution, that she had assumed this selfish, egotistic kind of look and behavior, so proud even in her last time. So they criticize that, but this is precisely the behavior that the vindicators of the Queen actually praised, that her spirit could not be broken, actually. So in Robinson's mind, she became a symbol of this fortitude and as a victim of patriarchal oppression, as I mentioned, and in a way was a model to other women.
There's a short question from Amy just asking, what was the British reaction to the White Terror?
I'm not sure about this. So yeah, I have to think.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't think of an answer as well. I'm not really sure. Yeah, sorry, Amy, we failed you. But yeah, it's an interesting, from a Gothic's perspective, I don't think there's any particular significant reflection of that as a separate manifestation of kind of the upheavals in France. the White Terror is a sort of counter-revolutionary, sort of the hunting down of members associated with the terror by those whose families had been affected by or killed in the terror, the 1793 to 1794 terror. Yeah, no, I can't think of anything coming out as separate myself, Amy. I don't know. It all just seems to be in a sort of blob of terror of what's going on in France in terms of how Britain is responding politically. I don't know what you think, Rayna.
Yeah, I think the focus is on this bloodshed, basically. So, but yes, as the Emigrant shows, English people, despite this faction again in the nation itself, they welcomed French emigres, the clergy, the aristocrats, and provided them shelter. Even Charlotte Smith was one that received an emigrant in her house, and her daughter actually married a Frenchman. So they showed sympathy and support. Yeah, from what I've read, some things are popping in my mind. After the Jacobin terror and the execution of Robespierre, I think those laws were kind of partly abolished, so emigres could return to the country. The clergy and the aristocrats, they could return to France without fear of persecution, right? But in terms of this specific topic, I need time to think and to go over my mental library to see what I've read. So yeah.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? Been quite a few questions this evening.
You may be interested in reading Williams's sketch, because as I pointed out, she presents her narrative again in this epistolary form from her perspective. So there are accounts of how English people, when the insurrection began and the basically the treaties was passed, they were all persecuted and haunted and hunted. Sorry. So she describes French officers coming to their houses and just dragging them to prison. And in one of the letters, I don't remember which number it was, she again describes the ferociousness of those officers, and that there was even that they were women, because she was there with her sister, they did not show any sympathy to them, right? Which is something to be expected, as showing some sympathy and some gentleness to the female sex. And there was just only one officer that showed them some softness, so to speak. So yeah, you may be interested in reading that from how English people in Paris at the time were persecuted.
Quick question from Burke.
Were there any other noticed negative reactions?
I think I was going to say, Frank, do you mean the French Revolution generally or the terror specifically?
Oh, they were at first very favorable. As I pointed out, they millenarists saw it as the apocalypse, which will basically bring this new heaven on earth. Humanity will regenerate. There will be equality, liberty, and yes, democracy will be basically this new heaven. So they supported the French Revolution, but it was the reign of terror that made them temper down their political views, because during that time you also have a number of acts that were passed. So the seditious acts, also the revolutionary societies in England, they were also threatened. So they had to change their views, even Coleridge, for example, who at first also supported the revolution, but then became disillusioned. He was considered to be a spy for a very long time because of his initial reception of the revolution, because of his initial support. So it is again a very tricky case. Who was actually a supporter for life, so to speak, and who had to take on a conservative view. And Wordsworth, he I think is the one to make this very radical change in terms of his political views, from this radically minded young man to a very conservative old man. And this was something that Shelley severely criticized him for, that he went to the other side, so to speak. He joined the other camp. But yeah, I mean, the French Revolution, it is a very significant event, because even in younger romantics, Shelley, Byron, for example, Mary Shelley as well. I mean, you have Frankenstein, could be interpreted as again this embodiment, this allegorical embodiment of what a revolution could be like, right? So they were influenced by the revolution, the ideas, the turn of events. So you can find its presence, so to speak, in their works.
I think, I'm not sure if what you would agree with this, Rayna, but I don't think it's a case of throwing everything away. I think a lot of thinkers tempered, as Rayna keeps saying, how they express their revolutionary sentiment and what they believed was possible. So you get a lot of this pre-terror conception of revolution as utopian, as a utopian conception of what can be achieved, and then tempered by this understanding of kind of mob rule and mob action and violence. So it's more of a tempering for many of them, I think, than it is a complete revolution. But what do you think, Rayna?
Yes, indeed. Again, to take, for example, Smith and Robinson. So although they criticized this turn of events, they continued to support the principles, right? Equality, freedom, the human rights. And this is actually a very significant topic in their works. And this is actually the topic of my thesis. This representation of reason and sensibility in terms of liberty and the political climate. So they continued to support reason and liberty and equality, but just criticized that it was taken to an extreme. It was basically those principles were trampled by the French revolutionaries, right? Because they had this very idealistic design, shall I call it, but then everything went all right, so to speak. So you have those, yes, in Coleridge as well. He continued to support the principles. He again laments the turn liberty took in France, and for these writers, Britain actually remains as this model of a kind of liberty that is social, that is reasonable, and it is something that is also traced in their works. Oh, okay. I was going to say, although with the emigrants, you again have this typical of Smith's ambivalent attitude, because by criticizing, so she shows support for the emigrants and even for for the French monarchs, for the clergy, while also criticizing French politics and the court and the turn of the revolution. And you also find certain interpolated political comments on the case in England, right? So that if there is no caution, history might repeat itself in Britain, right? So if changes are not made in society, right? So she also criticizes the social body, yeah, in England.
Yeah.
Yeah, the body politic. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else has any questions.
What is the giant teddy bear?
Oh, hey.
Oh, it's very sweet. Thank you for the giant teddy bear. Well, it's a giant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other questions that we failed to notice?
I don't think so. I think we got all the questions. And I think what both Rayna are doing are definitely what we both do in our research is focus very strongly on that exact period of the 1790s, really, and contemporary reactions as they occurred. I think that's true for both of us, right?
Yeah, I think so. So it is also interesting, again, this conception of sensibility and how it also acquire this negative status because of these excesses. And again, to quote Robinson's treatise, her Vindication of the Queen, she makes a very clear difference between sensibility, which is reason coupled with this philanthropic feeling for humanity and its suffering, and this sensual rage that had in the word escapes me. Capture, seized. The French. So there is a difference between this. And here we can open up another bracket about all this contested also place of enthusiasm, where enthusiasm could lead, right? Because again, associations with the French Revolution. I think, yeah, the French Revolution is this point where everything kind of goes into different directions and acquires those ambiguous and ambivalent and call it as you wish terms.
Yeah, there is a lot of rabbit hole to go into there.
Yeah, a lot of rabbit holes. Yeah, so it's a wonderland.
It really is.
A dark wonderland.
So does anyone else have any more questions or comments or things they'd like to bring up? No. Well, thank you so much for coming, everybody. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I'm going to stop recording.